Hello, listeners. Welcome back to the PeopleNova Podcast. My name is Rachel O'Neill. Today, we discuss large and impersonal political, corporate, or social structures regarded as intractably indivisible and uniform, better known as monoliths. These monolith structures are composed of humans. Humans, time and again, demonstrate the ability to shift thinking and collectively work together to challenge the status quo. Similar to how your startup disrupts the insurance industry or transportation industry or status quo of an entrenched industry. So let's listen in as we chat with Quiana Agbai. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the PeopleNova Podcast. I have a lovely guest with us today. I would love for you to introduce yourself to everyone.
Yes. Hi, everybody. I'm Quiana Agbai. I'm an Ohio native and currently residing in Boston. I'm a connector, a communicator, and a consultant, and I'm honored to be here.
Awesome. Oh my gosh, I love that. So fantastic story. Quiana and I met in the Boston area at a couple different networking events. And I think it was, the second or third time that we kind of bumped into each other, that we had that recognition moment of yes, we go to the same things. We have the same interests. So that was one reason why I wanted to have you on the podcast and chat with you about the human side of business. And we came up with this idea during quarantine as, tons of businesses were just shifting and adjusting and realizing, work online, life online is a whole lot different, but it really speaks to how you treat people, right? Humans. We do business with other people, not other businesses. There's LLCs and C Corps involved, but it's really about the people in the business that we want to engage with and we want to interact with.
Yes.
Yeah. So when we talk about that, what does that mean to you? That phrase, we do business with other humans.
Right. I think it's really easy to think of corporate structures as kind of monoliths and things in and of themselves, kind of these institutions that are immovable. And I think this notion of businesses as people kind of humanizes these structures. And I think in the wake of all the protests, especially, we're realizing, that we can, as people, push to have these institutions changed because by definition, people are the institutions. And so they're not as immovable as we previously thought. And I think when we're looking at it in terms of the current racial and social justice movements, I think it's helping us to realize that all of these companies, all of these corporations are really comprised of other humans, other citizens. And I think it makes them more accessible to change, and it keeps them from becoming so abstract that we just accept things as they are, know. And I really think that's been the beauty of what's happening, is that we're humanizing these things that we thought previously were immovable and permanent, forever structures that can now be modified, abolished, and reformed.
Reformed in a re-amalgamation, right? Yeah, so everybody went into quarantine, just to catch up listeners, everyone went into quarantine, and then June 2nd was Blackout Tuesday, where the genuine impact of the pandemic was hit hard in the Black community. And since the beginning of June 2nd, there's been a huge shift to protest and to bring justice to the police brutality element, but then also the economic impact to the Black community, which the fascinating research from the Boston Globe a couple of years ago was the net worth of the Black community is $8.
Right. And I thought that was an error. Even when I saw it, I was like, well, how is that the case? And I think, I grew up in Ohio, and I think coming out east, and especially when you're in a community that is so highly educated, and sometimes you just have to be careful about being in a bubble, realizing if you are in a circle of very high achieving, very highly educated people. Not everyone is like that. And I think we're able to check our own privilege regardless of our color, but looking at our socioeconomic status. And that study for me was very enlightening. That headline, when I saw that, I said, oh, there's no way that can be possible. And then I went deeper in the data and started to see some of that information that really opened my eyes.
Yeah. And I think, and I didn't read it recently, but I think one of the elements is around real estate and being able to own real estate or lack thereof, right? And when I was teaching university students, spring of 2020, I learned something about housing discrimination and how it was incredibly systemic, right? It was, in particular, the GI Bill was not available to Black veterans.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and redlining, Boston, of course, having its own toward history with redlining here,
Mm-hmm.
and just seeing how land ownership, property ownership going back for generations, even though it's easy to say, well, my ancestors didn't do that, it's being able to realize, or saying my ancestors did that, I'm not responsible, but seeing how you reap the benefit of it and how ancestors who may have been disenfranchised or discriminated against, their descendants on their end are also affected. So, when I see the quote that's basically saying, we didn't set up the system, but we have the opportunity to change the system and the outcome and how we interact with each other based on things that happened in the past.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. No, absolutely. It's definitely acknowledging that the system exists, that it is there, right? And I feel like a lot of white folks are just well-intentioned, yet don't really understand the systemicness of it. And I'm a kinesthetic learner. Well, I love the adult learning style, and so I'm always talking to folks to really help them understand. And I'm delivering a session on anti-racism for folks in the startup ecosystem. And I use the 3 learning modalities, the audio, the visual, and the kinesthetic learner, to help transition and say, all right, if you self-identify as like an audio learner or a kinesthetic learner or a visual learner, like how does that translate to racism, right? So visual learners are we see corporate America. We see all the white people at the board of directors and the CEO level and the C-suite level, right? So that's visual. The auditory learners, racism is like white noise. It's just there. White people can't hear it, but non-white people can absolutely hear it, right? And then I'm a kinesthetic learner. I have a standing desk. So I'm constantly moving, right? And I use the example of racism is like a laser maze, right? So there's little laser beams all across the room. And white people don't even know that there's laser beams there, and they just walk through, the space without, triggering any of the laser beams. But non-white people know that there's a laser maze. They just don't know what the consequences are of triggering those different laser mazes to really understand. So what do you think of those metaphors? Are they on point?
Yeah, that's, I hadn't thought of that before, learning styles and working to be anti-racist, and how does that impact? I think there are some things visually that are evident to me as someone who gravitates towards Instagram. I think there's been a lot done in that space, how to use social media for racial justice and social justice work. And so what is it? #Activism, I think it's called. I think there's been some really great visual ways to show what's happening. And it kind of lends itself to the argument, that we saw with George Floyd, and even before, of what role does it play to show the violence that's being perpetrated against Black bodies. And I think there's trauma, it's almost like trauma porn, and there's been a few people that have written essays about this saying, we really don't need to keep re-traumatizing Black people by showing the incidents, because, disproportionately when there's something that's happening, violence committed to a white person, you don't see clips perpetuated to the same rate that it's happening whenever this is being shown, Philando Castile in his car, and just going back over time, the way that these clips get disproportionately showcased when it happens to Black bodies. And so from a visual perspective, I see that argument kind of coming into play for that style of learning. There are some people who, very similar to what happened with Emmett Till, when his mother made the decision to deliberately have the open casket, and it was in Life magazine, that there were people who before may have only heard of it, but it really wasn't until those images were shown that it became so widespread, the understanding of the violence and atrocities that were happening to the Black community. So I do understand the role of showing, the violence perpetrated, especially when there's audiences who may be able to amplify what's happening or to see it and be spurred to action, right? But I think within the Black community, I know I'm very protective of not spreading those images and being very cognizant of the role that those type of images play when it comes to the notion of them being trauma porn. So that's kind of you explaining that. That's what it brings to mind for me.
That's great. If we stay with that thread for a little bit, I'm actually super intentional about my social medias and like how I'm as a white woman with privilege, right? Like I'm very careful about how I'm approaching all of my social medias, personal and professional and whatever. And I'm choosing to spread, messages of education, right? Like, hey, if you have questions, great. Like, I can talk about this without stuttering. Like, let's have a chat. Let's watch a documentary, right? Like, did you know this? I just learned it, right? And being able to, from a first person perspective, saying, I made mistakes. I'm always going to make mistakes, right? But then also helping to amplify Black joy. And there's a family, they're like social media trending, the Cabs family, Kabs. I think they're overseas somewhere, and it's this dad with his toddler daughter, and she sings karaoke in the car, and it's just the cutest thing ever, right? So I love sharing those forward because it's kids being kids, right? Little kids being adorable. Do you know Thaddeus Miles here in Boston?
No, I don't think so.
He's one of my I
follow so many. Thaddeus Miles?
Yeah, Miles, like drive miles. Yep, yeah. Thaddeus Miles. He was on a panel for Black History Month at Rapid 7, hosted by one of my good friends, Pamela Rosario Perez, who works there. And I saw him and I was like, oh my gosh, I'm like, Pamela, I just want to give him a hug. He's just such a wonderful person. And he's a photographer, and he does a lot with Black joy and positive images of Black men in the community, and really helping to nurture the next generation of Black men and have them feel their emotions, right? He's just a wonderfully and emotionally intelligent person, right? And so he does photography, and he's on LinkedIn, and he'll share his photography and everything. Also one of my dream guests on my podcast. So I'm trying so hard.
You never know, like when you look someone up and it's like, oh, we're already connected. So who knows?
Yeah. But those are kind of the ways that I feel is a good way to amplify, right? And say like, look, there's a different narrative out there. And if you want to look for a positive narrative, like, yes, the trauma is there. Yes, I'm not trying to ignore that fact, but I'm also trying to complement. I think in the world of positivity, there's a ratio for every one negative thing, you need 6 positive things to counteract, right? And so I'm like, all right, 6 to 1, here we go. I'm trying.
And you really have to be intentional about that. And I think, there's a lot of ways to be reckless on social media. And I think really going into the space and being intentional and figuring out, what, am I uplifting? Am I inspiring? Am I calling attention to something? And I think in the way that I move across social media, there is a way that it is a distraction for me. Sometimes when the world is too much, I will go on and just want to laugh or share something silly. And so I think one of the things that I do on my feed, I try to always amplify and inform, show my daily life as a mom here in Boston, but also being able to have some type of levity, because, you need to laugh, you need to have joy. It can't be, all gloom and despair all the time. But I think it is important to balance that. And so I'm always, almost like self-auditing where I'm like, okay, enough of the, hey, did you know this or that today? And then it's like, I'll show something silly that my 6-year-old son did, or a little goofy song he sang, or a clip of my daughter playing her ukulele or something.
I think we need a cameo ukulele. Like, this is just.
Yeah. So it's one of those things that I think you can be intentional about. And the beauty of it is that it's one place to kind of show up, get from it what you need, and then kind of like that iceberg metaphor, and I've brought this up before in previous interviews, to explain a lot of what I do is offline. So the social media piece is great because it gives you a wide-reaching platform, or even you and I being able to have this conversation and then amplify it and using the hashtags and getting the dialogue going. But I think it's really important to always continue to find ways to show up in your community. And of course, we have COVID happening right now, but I think there's still other ways to activate. We obviously have an election coming up. And I think with now the news coming out for those of us who are parents, and I think this directly impacts the business end of our conversation, is what's going to happen, in the fall now, and what's going to happen now where parents again are going to have to be doing some sort of distance learning and then balancing that with whatever rigid structures are in place in the companies that they're at. And so I think that's kind of the crossroads of where that might all come to a head. And it's also an opportunity to continue to look at ways that these structures that are actually people who probably a lot of them have kids or know people with kids, or their employees have kids.
Yeah.
What are ways that we can work together to make a system that's more supportive for all of us? Going back to social media, one of the beauties is also being able to be in community with people abroad, and the way that it kind of brings the world together. And so it's been really interesting, almost like a study for me, to look at my friends who are abroad, especially those raising families and balancing careers, to see what it's like when they're in a society or within a culture that values family, even the citizens valuing each other to pull together and to do what's best for the health of everyone. So I kind of look abroad wistfully, like, wow, that must be nice. But it also inspires me to look for ways to kind of push for us to do better here on the ground. And so that's kind of how it comes back full circle for me.
Yeah. So within organizations, we'll pick up that thread. Within organizations, I can't tell you how many times I've had to coach and chat with decision makers and leaders about work from home policies and like summer hours. And I'm like, we really have, okay, we have to talk about it. I'm like, okay, right? And I think, COVID really ripped the Band-Aid off for a lot of those folks who were very like in-person kind of old school, and very much like, I need to see you to know that you're working on stuff, right? And we really had to push the bounds of technology and really understand, like, how do we work with colleagues? How do we develop relationships with colleagues? How do we check in on folks, right? Without being, too nosy or too like in their business, but realizing that, especially with international colleagues, I have two of the folks on my team are in South Africa, right? And so I'm just like, whenever you want to work on stuff, that's fine, but like, we'll find a minute to get together. Yes. And then like, if you need me, you need me, like WhatsApp or Slack or email, like I'm available, but you do you.
Exactly. I agree. And I think, even for me, working with my sisters, we run a consulting company where we're helping to champion small businesses in the areas of marketing, graphic design, and PR. One of the things that happened for our company, even though we were already virtual, I think this push of Blackout Tuesday and everything that happened, last month, it really pushed people to seek us out and be intentional to find Black-owned businesses. And it's been a way also for us to partner with other Black-owned businesses to see, what are ways that we can either bring them on board for our clients or to send business their way in a referral method. So I think we saw a lot of, emphasis on, okay, white people, go find the Black people. But I mean, honestly, for me as a Black business owner, it was so helpful to see all these roundups, because it was like, oh my gosh, now I can be on my end, be very intentional about who I'm hiring and making sure as a business owner that I'm being able to bring some, wonderful Black-owned businesses to the table and spotlight them when I'm trying to, make purchasing decisions for my family, for my business. So I think it's been great all around. There's a podcast, I have to find it because I listen to so many podcasts, and it was a founder, a very prominent founder, who was trying to explain why diversity, this was before all of this, was like 4 years ago or something. And he was trying to explain why diversity makes economic sense, just from like a numbers perspective, and by shutting people out, how bad it really is for business. And I think, a lot of our emphasis as a capitalistic society, there's a lot of critiques to be made on our structures, but I think the opportunity that there is to think about racial justice, social justice being good for business is that we have the potential to all benefit, right? And so this notion of equal rights, equity, all of that being like a zero-sum game, to do away with that notion so that we don't have to think of it, as a pie. And I love it when that saying makes its around the memes that make their way around social media. But there's so many people who still think about it as a pie. And it's like, no, like when we open it up, it just makes it so much better for all of us. And so that little case study example for me in my business, and just seeing how Blackout Tuesday helped me by being able to find other business owners. Let's not make it just a one-time, moment. And this notion of, can the moment become the movement, right? And I hear a lot of people saying that, and that we're able to look at Asian-owned businesses and Latinx-owned businesses and LGBTQ. Like, can we open it up and just make it so that by the time my kids, are coming about adulthood, or even, before then, that they're able to just look at this and say, oh, well, this is how we always operate. This is the norm, right? Yeah. Let's normalize it.
Yeah, I love it. The fascinating thing is I'm totally calling out a lot of resources that were published, 2016, 2017, like long time ago, right? I saw a clip from I saw a clip from the Golden Girls where Don Cheadle was on, and he was trying to explain to Blanche, the character, about how the Confederate flag, right? And I'm like, that was 1988, folks. Like, this is not new. We've been trying to have these conversations, and it's terribly, like, it's been a blip, and it's been like, okay, and we're going to go back to our comfort zones, right? And so I'm super fortunate, like, this is terrible timing, but I'm super glad that a lot of people are really pushing the envelope and continuing to push the envelope and saying this is not okay, and we need to, really shift mindsets, right? Which is why I exist, right? To help people really, really understand that, that automatic way of thinking is no longer okay. And what do we need to do to educate? What do we need to do to talk about it and really articulate it, and not trigger feelings of shame or guilt or blame, or like poking fingers of like, well, you didn't do it, or you have a policy about, attendance and showing up late, and it really disproportionately impacts parents or single parents who maybe happen to be Black women, right? Managing households. And so really, really, really pushing that envelope. It does make so much economic sense. Yeah. Let's talk about the business that you run with your sisters.
Wonderful. So I have a background in advertising. So after graduating Wellesley, I ended up at an agency here in Boston, and I was able to work in that field, doing some media planning. I went client side in the marketing department. And then I ended up in New York City at an agency. And so it's really been great, having that experience, agency and client side, for about 8 years, and really wanting to look at ways that businesses are showing up. What are their marketing campaigns looking like, and, what practices can be in place to kind of champion the issues that we're talking about right now, which before, looking at allocating client budgets, there wasn't so much of a discussion back when I was graduating in 2002. to talk about what are ways that we can amplify diversity, equity, inclusion. And you might have those departments like the multicultural department or whatever, but I think now there's a greater opportunity for businesses to really be intentional in putting that into their business model. And so one of my sisters is a graphic designer and one of them is a publicist. And back when my family was relocating from New York City to Portsmouth, New Hampshire for my husband's job, I was looking at ways that our business, where my sisters and I were sending each other little freelance, bits of work. Is there a way that we could organize ourselves? And so my dad had actually said, hey, why don't you form a company? And then, looking at the requirements to do that, it seemed like it was just a little more advantageous to set that up in New Hampshire versus doing that when we were living in New York City. So back in 2014, we formed our LLC at the end of 2014 when I got to New Hampshire. And so this fall will make 6 years that we've been in formation, and it's been really great. I think now looking at the influx of companies, small businesses, a lot of solopreneurs who really want to come out the gate strong and have some type of marketing strategy, we're able to work with them on that and then bring in the expertise from a graphic design and PR perspective so that someone coming in doesn't have to feel like, oh my gosh, I have to find a separate graphic designer and then I need to get a publicist. And it's just so much easier for a small business owner to tap into all of our years of experience, corporate and agency experience, that they can tap into us. And because the three of us as small business owners, we empathize with a lot of the clients we work with. So it's really great that we are approachable. We can work from anywhere. A lot of times, at least for me as a mother, some of our clients we work with are parents too. And it's like, you know what, the only time I can talk is when the baby goes to bed. And I'm like, oh, me too. And so
awesome.
It's not the type of thing where, you're strictly, you can only do what you need to do between 9 and 5. It's kind of like what you were saying with your team in South Africa, that the way that business is really personal is that we're able to work with each other and accommodate each other. But I still think it's important to have boundaries and not to feel like, well, I can email you at 11 o'clock at night and,
and expect a response, right?
Right.
And I'm also very,
I get the different time zones, totally get it. But I think, especially coming out of Blackout Tuesday, where I was inundated, not just from my company, and it's Trifecta Media Group is the name, and I'll share all the links and things of that nature. But also from a social media perspective, because in 2009, I started a blog, like a mommy blog, just being a newlywed in Harlem and being pregnant and having my daughter there in Harlem. Like I literally got on the bus and went to the hospital and had my daughter. And so I think it was really cool to kind of showcase what that city mom life was like. I didn't think of it as a profit center, but over time being able to do things like brand ambassadorships and sponsored content and then turn it into speaking engagements. And I think really looking at ways that motherhood kind of transformed me into an activist. And I think it's something that I want to be very careful about. A lot of times when I'm interviewed now, are brought on board to speak on a panel, it's like, what is your title? And I'm like, mom human. Like, I don't want to be elevated in a way that it makes people think like, oh, that's what she's doing. Isn't that great? She aspired to that. It's more of like you need to come along. Like we need to come along and take up the mantle of work that needs to be done across the board. It just so happened me and my role as a mom kind of opened my eyes to ways that I could show up, and also spurred me to action. So when I was volunteering with Moms Demand Action as the Boston Community Outreach Lead, that was really helping me understand the role that gun violence plays in our community, and how even though Massachusetts overall has a very low number in gun deaths, what's happening in our Black and Brown communities in Boston disproportionately, what are ways that we can make a difference in those communities. And I think that was what really spurred me to want to get involved and know what's happening here, right? In New Hampshire, I actually had to shelter in place because we had an active shooter situation. And that was soon after we moved to New Hampshire. So I had my newborn son and my preschool daughter, and police officers knocked on our door and said, we have an active shooter across the street and you need to go to your basement. And I'm like, really? So I moved from Harlem, where none of this, we never had, like, there was never an active shooter situation on my—
To nice Portsmouth.
Exactly, right? So I think that in and of itself, when I give that example, it really broke down a lot of stereotypes that I think a lot of people think, oh, you had kids in New York City. Ooh, it must have been dangerous, dodging bullets. And I'm like, actually,
New Hampshire.
I'm like, it was actually pretty cool until we got to New Hampshire. But I think that really opened my eyes. And then having a front row seat to the election,
yeah,
you know, being in New Hampshire, and as you know, the different candidates were coming through, and even my daughter realizing, like, mommy, you're taking me to see Hillary, you're taking me to see Bernie, and why aren't we going to see the other person? And I'm like, ooh, I really appreciate you as a kindergartner, really holding me to task for listening to different viewpoints. But I had to explain to her, because of some of the things that I saw with safety, in regards to safety, and what I was seeing, you know, when that candidate would show up and what would happen in the crowd. I said, I just could not bring you, as your mother, you know, and keeping you safe, I just could not bring you to that environment. But I appreciate you being able to notice that we need to listen, right? It doesn't mean we have to agree, but we can at least listen. And so I saw that in my daughter, you know, and I think looking at how I could be involved politically, I'm very limited to what I can do politically because of the nature of my husband's job, but are there ways that I can show up? And
absolutely.
So that really spurred me to become more civically engaged. And so here we are now, you know, 2020 with another election on hand. And are there ways that I can show up and, you know, work with communities that might be experiencing voter suppression? Can I, you know, do a call to action, you know, amongst my friends, and find organizations to support? Can I donate? You know, can I tweet something out? Like, I think there's just so many ways to show up. And I just want to be careful of people who are like, oh, that's what you do.
Yeah.
Like, I want to call people in to kind of say,
folks, it's really easy. Like, this is how simple it is, right? Like, I know some people get overwhelmed with the paradox of choice, and they're like, oh my God, there's so many things, I can't do anything, like, shut down. Like, okay, this is not jam. Like, it's not pick and jelly here, people. Like, figure out what works for you. And if there are limitations, like you said, your husband's work, like, that's a limitation. It's a real limitation. Like, that's okay, right? Like, I have health concerns that prevent me from being at a riot or a protest or a march, right? And so I'm like, okay, but what else can I do? Man, I can rock a Zoom call like nobody's business. So, like, here we go, right? And so that's, you know, my medium, and that's how I show myself to other white people who have questions, who have concerns, who are not sure how to say white supremacy without stuttering or offending anyone, right? Like, okay, let's all make mistakes together, right? Kids, you said something, you know, kids have the best questions. They really do.
Oh my gosh.
And I'm a huge fan of Emmanuel Acho's work right now. Have you seen his videos, Uncomfortable Conversations with a Black Man?
I have. I'm torn on those.
Oh my gosh.
Torn. I don't know. Maybe it's because I'm married to a Black man. But it's one of those things where it's I get the intention. I understand the intention. And I saw with Chip and Joanna Gaines in particular, I think, you know, I was very much noticing a lot of white women being very vocal. You know, and I know Joanna, you know, she's biracial, I get it. But I was noticing, like, wow, there's a lot of white and white presenting women being very vocal all over, either showing up in the protests or writing think pieces and being interviewed. And I was like, where's all the white men? And so I started, like, looking around. The piece I wrote for Mom 2.0, you know, and I'll reshare the link for that as well. That piece got shared, and it got shared within LinkedIn. And I started seeing, once LinkedIn got a hold of that piece, I wrote about your anti-racism journey. there were way more white men engaging with my piece. But when I was looking on social media, I was really seeing a lot of vocal white women. And I specifically went to a bunch of accounts. I just made my way around, like, what is he saying about this? Or what is she saying about this? And I specifically went to Chip and Joanna's accounts, to their individual accounts.
Yeah.
I even went to some of their friends that I know they hang out with. And I was like, wow, Chip is silent, as he usually is. And it was really interesting, like leading up to the point of the video, the uncomfortable conversations with a Black man. And then Chip came out and is with his family, like sitting with the Black man. But I was like, okay. And I wonder how much of that, like what went in the background, right? And you can't know whatever push made, or maybe someone looked at their bottom line and was like, okay, fine, I gotta say something, you know? But it was one of those things where I'm like, wow, his wife is showing up in social media, but he kept everything very quiet, even on his Instagram. And then that video came out. So I don't know what to make of it, but I do recognize, in a sea of silence from white men, who maybe they feel threatened, maybe they're thinking of the pie, the equity as a pie. Yeah. And so someone's taking a piece of my pie, versus being open-handed. Maybe there's some of that that's at play, but I think it almost tokenized, or maybe it's just in the marketing of it. To me, the title was very off-putting, to tokenize a Black man as in, let's put the Black man on the stage and ask him all the questions we wish we could ask him. And it plays into that notion of emotional labor. I see a lot of Black women in particular fielding, and it's happened to me and in my inbox, where it's like, you know, we could during quarantine figure out how to make sourdough bread. Like, we could figure that out. But now all of a sudden, with issues surrounding Black Lives Matter, like, we really can't look up these topics. We really can't look up book lists that have been out there for years. Years. Yes. When I get my Facebook memories, it's almost laughable at this point, because I go back, you know, 4 to 6 years, and I'm like, man, I've been talking about these topics and share resources all these years, yet I will still get pinged to say, well, can you give me a blah, 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 or share with me this, blah, blah, like I'm a resource. And I'm like, no, these things are out there, and I can't be your Black Google friend. Like, I can't. Like, you have to be able to sit and do the work in the same way that you perfected that sourdough recipe. You have to be able to sit down and really intentionally put the hours in to learn. And so that point, you know, going back to the piece I did with Mom 2.0, when I talked about your anti-racist journey as till death do you part, right? And that just came up in a conversation I was having organically with someone, and I was just like, oh, it's till death do you part. And so I think it's one of those things that seems so daunting, but this notion that we need to pace ourselves and prevent ourselves from running out of steam. When we live in a culture that loses attention and quickly looks over to the next issue at hand, can we maintain the dialogue and the conversation and really commit to making systemic change, and not just changing, you know, street signs or painting Black Lives Matter? Like, those symbolic things are, I get it, I get the role they play, but what are we going to do when it's time to show up at the polls in November? And what are we going to do after that, when we have to vote in midterm elections and make changes in our backyard, right?
Yeah, no, it's a great point. And I love your sourdough example. Like, folks, we figured out how to do sourdough. Like, you can't figure out how to Google a book or like watch a movie or like, talk to your white friends about racism. Like, why can't you do that? You talk about sourdough. Well, you know, I don't want to upset anyone. I'm like, great. So you get to be comfortable and everybody else gets to be uncomfortable as they watch their family, you know, get choked by the police. Like, that's not great. Yeah. So I watched all of the episodes with Emmanuel Acho, and the one specifically with Chip and Joanna. And like, also, you just taught me that you're an A+ Google stalker of like everyone's social media. So I'm like, oh God, what's on mine? But one of their children asked Emmanuel a question, and the question was, "Are you afraid of white people?" Mm-hmm. And I thought that Emmanuel's answer was really amazing and gave a great metaphor. I'm not going to give it away, so everybody has to go watch the episode, but a really great metaphor of like how he as a Black man thinks about his interactions with white people, right? And I know that every time I put myself in a community of color, everyone else is looking at me as the white person of like, all right, how do I interact with her, right? And I've had to work myself, again, way before all of, the Blackout Tuesday and everything, to really earn that trust and to show up and to be consistent in order for folks to start at least recognizing my face. That's all. They don't know my name, that's fine. but at least recognizing me. So it's a journey. It's till death do you part, right? I've been trying to do this for 20 years on the corporate side, right? And so the employment, systemic racism in employment, like I've been chipping away for whatever, small impact that I can have. And I know I've ruffled feathers, and I know that I've pushed back on people who want to be comfortable, and didn't go so well for me, but that's fine. You learn and you move on. So, I want to transition a little bit, and I like to ask all of my guests, what's your favorite art?
Oh, my favorite art. Well, I really love Alvin Ailey and the dance company. I don't know if it was at the beginning of COVID, but they were putting out some really inspirational videos from the company, kind of piecing it together. There were some things they did on Zoom and showcasing a few things that hadn't ever been shared before online. And I think it just opened it up so beautifully for people to partake. I've seen it twice in person, and I've taken my daughter to see it with me before too, here when it came to Boston. And I just think it's such a beautiful history for people to be able to see dance in explaining the American, the Black American experience. And so I absolutely love Alvin Ailey, and anytime that I can watch a clip, or in the future, whenever theaters open up to be able to go again in person, it does a lot for me when I watch it. I find it to be very healing.
That's wonderful. Oh, I love it. I love asking everyone that I chat with, because there's so much art in the world, and everyone has a different modality or a different interpretation. But I love how you said that, like it touches you. Art is supposed to touch us.
Right.
One of my favorite quotes is from Darren Walker, the CEO of the Ford Foundation. And he said, "Without art, there is no empathy. Mm-hmm. And without empathy, there is no justice." It gives me chills when I think about that. I'm an artist. I love art. We chatted about that. I really think that being able to open up to those emotions and really feel those feelings is really important. And earlier in the session, we were talking about, are white men so scared? Are they afraid? Like, why aren't there white men talking about this, right? Are they still doing the pie, calculations? But I do think there's a little bit of white men not knowing how to feel their feelings, right? And so if we are, at least that's my philosophy, non-expert, right? But trying to work through that and help expose people to art and different mediums and different modalities, right? And different artists, and aside from the standard white majority expectation of museum art, right? Like, okay, no, let's do something different. Let's look at a different piece, a different, artist, and
bodies in movement, bodies in space. There's something so powerful about that.
Yeah. Quiana, thank you so much for joining us. I've loved chatting with you. We've chatted about a bunch of resources. I promise listeners, we'll put them in the notes so that you can all listen and click on it and follow up more. We're going to give a huge shout out to Trifecta Media Group when the episode launches, so that everyone can overwhelm your website and just funnel work your way, because I totally believe in it.
Thank you. This was wonderful. The hour flew by.
It's amazing how well it does, right? Like, just super quick. Thank you for joining us on the PeopleNova Podcast. My name is Rachel O'Neill. The team here at PeopleNova Human Capital would love to hear from you. We are always curious to hear from our listeners. So go ahead and send us an email, podcast@peoplenovahc.com. with your workplace questions or suggestions for who you'd like to see on our show. If you send us an audio memo, we may include your question on the show. Lastly, we are here to amplify. Our guests are amazing entrepreneurs, and we want you to forward our newsletter to someone in your network who needs to know the amazing things our guests are doing, so together we can make an impact. Thank you so much. Take care, and we will see you next time.